Optics. They've been one of the most important advancements for firearms. The ability to clearly see a target and fire accurately is invaluable. And in a gunfight, you need an optic that's just as rugged and reliable as your firearm. There's one optic that reigns supreme when it comes to reliability, and subsequently has shown up in many video games. Of course, I'm talking about the Trijicon ACog. But before we talk about the ACog, a word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Vict Optics. Vict Optics is a division of Vector Optics that makes high-quality sights and accessories, primarily for airsoft use. From red dots, rifle scopes, and LPVOs, Vict Optics has many different optics and attachments to choose from. Take for instance, the new SOI LPVO. Featuring 1.5 to 5 times magnification, this optic can handle both close and further engagements. Weighing at just 7.9 ounces, the scope is light, while giving you the capability to switch magnifications on the fly. And with both red and green illumination options, the SOI LPVO can be adapted to suit your shooting preferences. Vict Optics sights are robust as well. They'll handle the recoil of any airsoft gun easily. If you're interested in getting your own Vict Optics sight, go to the link below and use coupon code CIVILIANUSEONLY10 for 10% off. Thank you again to Vict Optics for sponsoring this video. The concept of a firearm optic may seem futuristic, but it actually dates back to as early as the 17th century. The story goes that an English amateur astronomer by the name of William Gascoigne left a telescope with the case open, where a spider wove a thread in front of the telescope lens. When William looked through the telescope, he realized that the web could focus with objects seen through the telescope. Inspiration struck, and the concept of the telescopic sight was born. These early optics were rather simple, but introduced some core concepts that optics today still adhere to. Firearm optics must be fully adjustable for windage and elevation, have clear glass to identify targets, and must be reliable enough to stay zeroed through recoil. Earlier optics were more or less simply telescopes mounted to rifles. They were mostly fixed magnification, and were used more as a means to spot the enemy, rather than to shoot at distance. These optics also tended to be large and heavy, limiting their use to longer range weapons, where weight and size were less important traits. Telescopic sights certainly have their uses. Their closest modern relative would be the rifle scope. Rifle scopes are usually large optics with very high levels of magnification. They are meant for taking long-range shots. While technology for both rifle scopes and rifles has advanced to the point where shots at very long distances are possible, a couple inherent downsides remain. Rifle scopes are usually much larger than their counterparts, and depending on the model, can be somewhat fragile. So, for most close-range firearms, iron sights were the predominant method of aiming. But in the 20th century, that would rapidly change. Almost 400 years later in 1986, an engineer by the name of Bindon was staring at another optical device, a pair of disassembled binoculars. Rather than a series of lenses like in a scope, a binocular uses prisms in either tube to create an image. While examining the binoculars, Glynn had an idea. Take the internals of a binocular and apply it to a rifle optic. Consulting with experts, Glynn was told that this would be problematic, namely, that making such a compact sight would induce a poor sight picture. But nevertheless, Glynn, at a friend's machine shop, created the prototype of his new optic. It was promising. The sight picture was incredibly clear, and the optic was significantly lighter and smaller than most other magnified optics on the market. As a first prototype, it was a huge success. Glynn was an experienced engineer with a breadth of work experience. He was an engineer at Ford, and also was the founder and owner of an optics company, Armson USA. Some of his previous work involved working on American military contracts. With his new sight, he saw an opportunity for his new lightweight optic to be utilized by the American military. So, Glynn got to work, making his optic as durable as possible. Using the same material that AR-15s are made out of, he designed a housing for his optic that could survive the harshest environments, while remaining as light as possible. It was an innovative design that strived to provide the benefits of an optic while minimizing as many of the traditional downsides of an optic as possible. So Glynn gave it a fitting name, the Advanced Combat Optical Gun Sight. In 1987, Glynn changed the name of his company from Armson to Trijicon, and 2 years later, the patent for the ACog was submitted. Meanwhile, back in 1985, the US Army initiated the Advanced Combat Rifle Program. This was a program intended to find a replacement for the M16 and M4 rifles. There were a number of novel rifles entered into the competition, and some innovative designs regarding ammunition as well. Plastic rifles, rounds that fired 2 bullets instead of 1, and even caseless ammunition. These contestants were the cutting edge of firearms technology. Of course, a rifle is useless if you can't hit anything with it. Though other optics existed at the time, military trials are known to be incredibly harsh, meant to simulate the realities of combat. There were few optics at the time that could endure such punishment. The ACog was part of this small group. Word was spreading about the ACog, and how it was a robust optic that could produce a clear image even under adverse conditions. During the test, one rifle was seen with the ACog attached, the AAI Advanced Combat Rifle. Ultimately, the Advanced Combat Rifle program was cancelled, with none of the prototype rifles proving superior to the M16. But the little optic that never failed was not forgotten. Slowly but surely, more and more professional organizations around the world began buying the ACog. US Special Operations Command extensively tested models of the ACog that used a fiber optic cable on top of the sight to draw in light, which created an illuminated reticle. They found this optic setup ideal for the bright, wide-open environments that the US military was increasingly finding themselves involved in. However, while the ACog was seeing growing success, it was still relatively unknown worldwide. But that was soon all to change. In the early 21st century, American military mobilization in the Middle East was at its height. At the forefront of many of these operations was the United States Marine Corps. Their issued rifle for frontline troops at the time was predominantly the M16A4, a rifle specifically designed to easily attach an optic. And to that end, in August 2005, the Marine Corps officially adopted the ACog as their first official rifle combat optic. The ACog was a huge success. In combat, it proved to be extremely effective. For personnel who had previously trained on shooting iron sights, the ACog was much easier to shoot with, and the results were immediate. In fact, some US Marine Corps units allegedly came under investigation due to finding a disproportionate amount of deceased enemy combatants with gunshot wounds to the head. The assumption being that Marines had executed these combatants. But upon further investigation, the truth was much simpler. The ACog enabled the Marines to be accurate enough to hit combatants that would only expose their heads. Then Major General James Mattis, the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division during Operation Iraqi Freedom, said, quote, "The ACog mounted on the M16 service rifle has proven to be the biggest improvement in lethality for the Marine infantryman since the introduction of the M1 Garand in World War II. In hindsight, a durable optic that can display a clear image with a bright reticle seems like an obvious candidate for success. But the ACog was the first, and is still heavily used to this day." Today, there are many different variants of the ACog, different levels of magnification, battery-powered models, and even ACOGs that can mount a small red dot on top. But regardless of variant, the ACog in general remains popular with military, law enforcement, and civilians. Because of this, the ACog is perhaps the most proven and reliable optic to date. Due to its success around the world, it's no surprise that various models of the ACog have shown up in many different games. But while the number of games the ACog shows up in is high, the players who use them in these games is significantly less. So, Why is such a renowned optic in real life mostly shunned in games? To break this down, we first need to re-examine the ACog's success in real life. The ACog saw its trial by fire in the sands of the Middle East. In that environment, many engagements were at longer distances, and for these firefights, the ACog proved extremely useful. Having 4 times magnification meant that soldiers could identify hostiles at distance and fire accurately. Additionally, along with the ACog itself was a new technique for aiming. Traditionally, while using non-illuminated optics, most shooters will close one eye to stare into the scope. This allows a shooter to see through a scope, but also means losing a significant amount of peripheral vision, as well as having the optic housing obscure the target. But with illuminated optics such as the ACog, the preferred method is to shoot with both eyes open. The dominant eye sees the reticle, while the other eye sees the target and surroundings. When these two images are processed by the brain, what the shooter ends up seeing is the reticle superimposed on the target, with no other obstructions. In real life, this shooting method works extremely well, and is the proper way to use the majority of illuminated low magnification optics. However, in games, aiming does not work this way. Most games render the optic housing in full, which can obscure much of the target. As a result, the popular optics in games are the ones with the most minimalist housing available, like the infamous Ultra Dot Pan AV. The ACog housing is large. If shooting with both eyes open, this isn't an issue, but in games where the housing is fully rendered, this can easily obscure a target. Having to stare through a huge monocular that takes up a significant part of the screen just isn't fun. The other aspect of the ACog's unpopularity in games has to do with games themselves. In real life, the ACog is ideally used at distance, but in most games, firefight distances aren't very far, with most games barely rendering the equivalent of 400 meters. With firefights in games taking place at such close distances, the advantage of a magnified optic is diminished. Up close, a magnified optic becomes difficult to use, especially on rifles that have higher recoil. In most games, the 4 times magnification of an ACog just isn't necessary. Of course, there are games where firefights do happen at further distances, but in the real world, optics that are able to adjust the level of magnification have become popular. Low-power variable optics and red dot magnifiers allow a user to switch between various magnification levels to suit their situation. And as these modern optics have gained popularity in real life, they've also made their way into games. In real life, these optic options have downsides, namely that LPVOs aren't as durable as the ACog, or that red dot magnifiers can be difficult to see through. But in games, these problems don't exist. So in most games, it makes more sense to equip these modern selections with variable magnification that can adapt to a variety of scenarios. All this is to say that while the ACog isn't usually terrible in games, it's also usually outclassed by most other optic choices. Many of the advantages of the ACog do not translate well into games. Of course, when discussing the ACog in games, there's one very notable exception to the ACog's otherwise mediocrity in the virtual world. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege is a game that pits 2 teams of 5 against each other. Similar to other competitive shooters, it's a 1 life per round system. If you die, you're out. So, eliminating even just one opponent is a big deal. Teams are sorted into attackers and defenders. When the game starts, defenders have time to set up their defenses, while attackers plan an attack. At least, that's how it should work. Rather than planting defenses, some defenders will simply choose a window and pick off attackers as they approach the building. It's a dirty trick, but it works well. Eliminating attackers early on in a round is a huge advantage. Complicit to this strategy was the ACog. The increased magnification the ACog provided made it much easier to see oncoming attackers and neutralize them. This was a strategy that was never banned, and as a result, became very popular. But while it was never against the rules, and it was certainly effective, it felt unfair to those on the receiving end. So, there were many discussions on how to reduce the use of this strategy, and consistently at the forefront of these discussions was the ACog. Much like its real counterpart, the ACog provided the user with a clear, magnified image at distance. And just like the Marines in Fallujah, these defenders were claiming a disproportionate amount of headshots. Ultimately, the game developers reworked the ACog entirely, and removed it from a number of operators. If anything else, perhaps the ACog's reign of terror in Rainbow Six Siege was a taste of how insurgents felt fighting against Marines with M16s and ACogs. These days, opinions on the ACog are somewhat varied. Most people don't deny its impressive reliability, but there are a number of other criticisms leveled at the optic. Namely, some believe that the ACog is too expensive, has too little eye relief, and does not offer enough control over reticle brightness. But when it comes to firearms and firearm accessories, reliability is everything. A firearm that is unreliable is useless, and an optic needs to be just as reliable as the firearms they sit on. It can be the difference between life and death. Reliability counts for a lot, and many are willing to overlook the ACog's disadvantages because it almost never fails. It's not the best at long range, nor is it ideal for close encounters, and for that reason, it's not very popular in games. But if you need an optic you can count on every time, there is no substitute for the ACog.